By early September 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal had become a fight for survival. The US Marines of the 1st Marine Division clung to a thin strip of land surrounding Henderson Field, the airfield that controlled the island, and the sea lanes between America and Australia. Every day brought new Japanese shelling, night raids, and rumours of fresh landings. The Marines called it Cactus, the code name for their precarious foothold in the South Pacific. To the north of the airfield, a narrow rise of coral and jungle-covered ridges offered a clear view over the perimeter. It was no more than a mile long, with steep slopes and dense brush, but to any soldier who studied it, it was obvious. Whoever held those ridges could see and strike directly into Henderson Field. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, commander of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, knew it. A combat veteran with steel-grey hair and calm eyes, Edson had already led his men through raids in Tulagi and Tasimboko. When ordered to move his raiders to the ridge on September 11th, he understood exactly what that meant. "They're coming," he told his officers. "They'll try to take that airfield by night. We'll be here to stop them." His force was small, about 840 men, mostly from the 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion. They carried rifles, Browning automatic rifles, light machine guns, and 60mm mortars. Behind them, engineers and airfield personnel manned improvised positions, digging in with whatever tools they could find. Ammunition was limited. There would be no retreat. The Marines called it simply the Ridge. After the battle, it would be renamed Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge. The Japanese knew it too. Across the Matanikau River, the 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi prepared to attack. Kawaguchi's men, over 3,100 strong, were veterans of Malaya, Singapore, and Borneo. They believed they had encircled the Marines and would deliver a decisive blow to reclaim Henderson Field. Kawaguchi promised his men they would crush the enemy in one night. On the evening of September 12, 1942, as a tropical dusk settled over the island, Edson's raiders dug in along the spine of the ridge. The air was thick with humidity and tension. The jungle beyond was silent, but the Marines could sense movement in the darkness. Flares from Henderson Field cast brief white light across the treetops. Then everything went quiet. Too quiet. At 9 p.m, the first shells whined overhead. Japanese mortars opened up, followed by bursts of machine gun fire from the tree line. Edson's men tensed behind their positions. A few minutes later, voices rose from the darkness, shouts in Japanese growing louder. Then the cries turned into a roar. "Banzai! Banzai!" The ridge exploded into chaos. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged out of the jungle, their bayonets glinting in the faint moonlight. Some carried swords, others grenades or flamethrowers. Their plan was simple: overwhelm the Marines through sheer momentum. The raiders opened fire with rifles, BARs, and machine guns. The night lit up with tracer fire. Mortars thumped from the rear positions, and grenades exploded in the trees. But the enemy kept coming, stumbling through their own dead, screaming and firing as they advanced. For an hour, the ridge became a slaughterhouse. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the firing slackened. The Japanese pulled back into the jungle to regroup. The Marines reloaded in silence. They knew it wasn't over. The ridge was still theirs, but only for now. Lieutenant Colonel Edson walked the line, pausing beside every machine gun, speaking quietly to his men. "You've done fine," he said. "You've held them. But they'll be back. They always come back." He was right. In the darkness beyond the ridge, Kawaguchi's remaining 2,500 men were already forming up for the next assault. The Japanese still believed they had surrounded the Americans. By dawn, that belief would cost them more than 3,000 lives. The first assault on the night of September 12th had been violent, but it was only a probe, a test of the Marines' defences. The Japanese 35th Infantry Brigade withdrew into the jungle to regroup, confident that they had found the weak point in the American line. Their commanders believed the Marines were outnumbered and exhausted, and that a coordinated attack from multiple directions would finish them before sunrise. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi planned to attack again the next night, September 13th, with everything he had left. His orders were clear and uncompromising: seize the ridge, capture Henderson Field, and annihilate the Americans. He had no doubt of victory. His men outnumbered the Marines nearly 4-1, and Japanese doctrine had always taught that the power of will, saishin, could overcome any material disadvantage. For Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, and his 840 Marines, the night of September 13th began with exhaustion and foreboding. They had already fought for hours the previous night, and the bodies of Japanese soldiers lay piled before their positions. Many of Edson's men hadn't eaten in 2 days. Ammunition was running low. The humid air stank of blood and decay. Shortly after dusk, the first distant bugle calls echoed from the jungle, eerie and out of place, followed by the rhythmic drumming of Japanese signal gongs. Edson moved along the line, stopping at each position. "They're coming again," he told his men. "Stay low. Aim at the flashes. Make every round count." The Marines on the ridge crouched behind logs, trenches, and crude sandbag walls. Below them, the jungle came alive with movement, hundreds of shadows weaving through the trees. Then, just after 10 p.m., the second wave hit. Thousands of Japanese soldiers surged up the slopes, firing rifles, shouting, and throwing grenades. Machine gun tracers tore through the darkness, and mortar rounds burst across the ridgeline. The roar was deafening, a mixture of gunfire, explosions, and screams. For nearly an hour, the Marines held their fire until the enemy was within 50 yards, then unleashed everything they had. The Browning machine guns chattered in controlled bursts. Bars fired from both flanks. Mortars dropped shells into the trees, showering the attackers with shrapnel. Entire platoons of Japanese infantry were cut down before they reached the wire, but still they came on. In the centre, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, under Major Kenneth Bailey, bore the brunt of the assault. The fighting was so close that Japanese soldiers threw grenades into Marine foxholes, only to be met with return grenades thrown back before detonation. Some Marines resorted to knives and entrenching tools when ammunition ran out. At one point, Japanese troops managed to penetrate the left flank and seize a small portion of the ridge. Edson immediately called for counterattacks. He moved through the chaos with his carbine slung low, shouting encouragement and directing fire under tracer-lit skies. "Hold this line!" he yelled. "If they take this ridge, they'll take the field. And if they take the field, we're finished." His presence steadied the men. Wherever he appeared, morale seemed to surge. By midnight, the Japanese had launched at least 5 separate attacks, each one beaten back by sheer Marine discipline. The bodies of Japanese soldiers carpeted the slopes so thickly that some Marines used them for cover. A few tanks had been promised by Kawaguchi to support the assault, but the jungle terrain made movement impossible. The Japanese infantry were on their own. The fighting reached its peak around 2 a.m. Waves of attackers crashed into the Marine lines, bayonets clashing in brutal hand-to-hand combat. In the centre of the ridge, the Marines' defensive line buckled under the pressure. Edson's raiders fell back about 100 yards to a secondary position near the base of a knoll, later nicknamed Edson's Knob. Here, in a space no wider than a football field, the fate of Guadalcanal was decided. Edson regrouped what was left of his raiders, barely 200 men still combat effective, and positioned machine guns in a tight semicircle. Japanese troops charged again, screaming "Banzai" and firing rifles from the hip. The Marines answered with interlocking fire that mowed them down in waves. Every few minutes, mortars dropped more shells onto the jungle below. For 5 straight hours, the ridge was lit by gunfire and tracer rounds. The ground shook under explosions, and the air was filled with smoke and screams. Corpsmen crawled between foxholes, dragging the wounded to the rear. Some Marines fought until their machine guns overheated, then switched to rifles or pistols. At one point, a Japanese officer broke through the line wielding a sword and slashed 2 Marines before being shot point-blank by a corporal with a .45. Another Marine was found the next morning with an empty bar beside him. He had stayed at his post until he was killed, his weapon still hot. Shortly before dawn, the attacks began to taper off. The last desperate Japanese Banzai charges broke against the Marine positions and melted back into the jungle. The ridge was littered with dead and wounded, nearly 1,500 Japanese soldiers in front of the Marine lines alone. When the sun rose, the surviving raiders could see the full horror of what they had endured. The ground was covered with weapons, helmets, and bodies lying in tangled heaps. Smoke drifted from the jungle, and the groans of wounded men echoed faintly from the slopes. The Marines were filthy, blood-stained, and exhausted, but they were still there. They had held, and Edson knew they would have to hold again. Kawaguchi still had more than 1,000 men left, and he would not give up. The next night would decide everything, not only for the Marines on the ridge, but for the entire Guadalcanal campaign. If Henderson Field fell, the Pacific could still fall with it. The sun rose on September 14, 1942, over a landscape of ruin. Smoke drifted from shell holes, and the bodies of fallen Japanese soldiers carpeted the slopes in front of the ridge. For a few hours, the Marines caught their breath. They cleaned weapons, redistributed ammunition, and tried to bandage what wounds they could. Many hadn't slept in 2 days. They knew the next attack was coming. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, walked the ridgeline with quiet purpose. He'd been in combat long enough to recognize the look in his men's eyes, fatigue bordering on collapse. He moved from foxhole to foxhole, speaking softly, keeping them anchored. "Hold this ground," he told them. "There's nowhere else to go." He was right. Behind the ridge lay Henderson Field, the only airstrip the Marines possessed. If the Japanese broke through, they'd overrun the airfield and drive every American off Guadalcanal. There was no fallback position, no reserve. Edson's 840 raiders and parachutists were all that stood between the Japanese army and victory. Down in the jungle, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was making his final preparations. He had already lost nearly half his men, but he believed the Americans were on the verge of breaking. He sent word through his battalion commanders. "The enemy is weak and exhausted. One more assault will finish him. Tonight we will crush the barbarians and retake the airfield." At sunset, the tropical heat gave way to heavy rain. Thunder rolled over the island, masking the rumble of movement in the jungle below. The Marines listened as they worked. Distant metallic clicks shouted orders, the sound of branches breaking. Then, as the rain began to fall harder, the jungle went silent. At 6 p.m., the Japanese opened fire. Mortars and machine guns swept across the ridge. Moments later, hundreds of soldiers surged out of the tree line, screaming "Banzai!" and charging directly into the Marines' fire. The battle instantly became chaos. Marines fired until barrels glowed red, machine guns rattled non-stop, and tracers tore through the rain like glowing wires. The enemy came in waves, groups of 50, then 100, sometimes crawling over their own dead to reach the line. On the left flank, Japanese troops briefly broke through and reached the Marine rear area. Raiders counterattacked with bayonets and grenades, fighting hand-to-hand among wrecked trees and shell holes. Corporal Lee Diamond, manning a .30 caliber machine gun, kept firing even after shrapnel tore into his leg. When his gun jammed, he grabbed a rifle and kept shooting. He would later receive the Navy Cross for his actions. The Japanese attacked with extraordinary courage but little coordination. Lacking radios, they relied on whistles and shouted orders that the Marines could hear even over the gunfire. Each time the attackers massed for another charge, American mortars zeroed in and broke them apart. The ridge became a storm of explosions and screaming steel. Edson's command post was barely 30 yards behind the front line. He moved constantly, directing fire and pulling stragglers back into position. Several times he personally joined the firing line with his carbine. When his adjutant suggested withdrawing to a secondary position, Edson shook his head. "No," he said. "If we fall back now, we lose everything. We hold here." By 9 p.m., the entire ridge was under attack. Flares from Henderson Field illuminated the scene. Flashes of white light revealing the shapes of charging soldiers, the silhouettes of machine guns, and the outlines of the knoll now known as Edson's Knob. It became the centre of the battle. Edson gathered what remained of his raiders, fewer than 250 men still capable of fighting, and repositioned them around the knoll. "This is it, boys," he told them. "This is where we hold the line. If they get past us, there's no one left." The next wave came minutes later. Japanese troops advanced uphill, stepping over bodies, firing rifles and throwing grenades. They reached the lower slopes, and the Marines opened fire with everything they had left: rifles, Thompsons, BARs, and shotguns. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the ridge in brilliant arcs, slicing into the darkness. The smell of cordite and blood hung thick in the air. At times, the line seemed to vanish entirely. Groups of Marines fought back to back, hurling grenades into the darkness and firing at flashes of movement. The rain turned the ground to mud, and men slipped as they fought hand to hand. Bayonets clashed, knives flashed. Japanese officers wielding swords led charges directly into machine gun fire and were cut down one after another. Through it all, Edson's calm voice carried over the din. He moved among his men, calling out targets, ordering ammunition resupply, steadying those who faltered. One Marine later recalled, "He walked up and down that line like he couldn't be killed." Every time you saw him, you knew you could hold another minute. By midnight, the attacks began to slow. The Japanese had thrown nearly every available man at the ridge and gained only a few yards. The ground below the Marines' position was now a sea of bodies. In places, the Japanese dead lay stacked 3 deep. Machine gun barrels glowed dull red, and some crews cooled them with canteen water to keep firing. A final, desperate charge came around 0200. About 200 Japanese soldiers stormed the centre, reaching the Marine foxholes in a last attempt to break through. The fighting was savage and close. One raider sergeant was found the next morning lying among a dozen enemy bodies, his rifle bayonet snapped in half. Another Marine beat back attackers with a trenching tool after his gun jammed. When the last of the Japanese fell, the line finally held. As the firing faded, the men looked around in disbelief. The ridge was still theirs. They had been hit by more than 3,000 attackers and had held with fewer than 800 men. Nearly half of Edson's force were dead or wounded, but the field below was a charnel house. At dawn, the Marines rose from their foxholes, numb and silent. They had survived the most intense night battle of the Pacific War. Below them, the enemy had vanished, leaving behind over 1,200 dead on the slopes and more in the jungle beyond. Edson walked the line, his uniform soaked in rain and blood. "You did it," he told his men quietly. You held. He knew what it meant. Henderson Field and Guadalcanal itself had been saved, but the price was written on the ridge. The next morning, the raiders began calling it by the only name that fit: Bloody Ridge. The morning of September 14th, 1942, broke clear and eerily calm. The rain had stopped, and the smell of cordite, blood, and burned powder hung over the ridge like a fog. For the first time in 2 nights, the Marines could see what they had survived. The slopes below were blanketed with the bodies of Japanese soldiers. They lay twisted among shattered trees and shell craters, rifles still clutched in their hands. Some were draped over the barbed wire where they had fallen. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that follows when the shouting, shooting, and dying finally stop. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson stood near his command post on the knoll that now bore his name. He was pale and unshaven, his uniform soaked and torn, his carbine blackened from use. Around him, Marines were emerging from foxholes like men returning from another world. Most of them hadn't slept in 48 hours. Some still gripped their rifles in a daze. Corpsmen moved quietly among them, checking pulses and bandaging wounds. When Edson surveyed the battlefield, he understood the magnitude of what they had done. In 2 nights of fighting, his force, 840 Marines and paratroopers, had stopped a Japanese brigade of over 3,100 men. The Japanese had expected to capture Henderson Field by dawn. Instead, they had been annihilated. The Marines' losses were severe, but not crippling: 59 killed and 194 wounded. The Japanese suffered catastrophic casualties, at least 1,200 dead on the field, another 1,000 wounded and hundreds more missing, lost in the jungle. In total, over 3,000 men from the 35th Brigade were killed, wounded, or scattered. Their commander, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, escaped with a handful of survivors and retreated into the interior, leaving behind the dead and the dream of retaking Guadalcanal. For the Marines, the aftermath was both victory and horror. They walked among the fallen, recovering weapons and collecting dog tags. The stench was overwhelming in the tropical heat. Japanese bodies lay piled in mounds where machine guns had cut them down by the dozen. Marine gunners found their own weapons scorched from constant firing. Some water-cooled Brownings had boiled their coolant away entirely. Every gun, every rifle, had been used to its limit. Reporters who arrived at the ridge later would call it the battlefield that smelled of victory and death in equal measure. Edson gathered his officers for a brief report, his voice hoarse from shouting through 2 nights of battle. "We held because every man did his job," he said simply. "There's nothing more to it." That humility masked the truth. It had been leadership that saved the ridge. Edson's calm under fire, his refusal to withdraw, and his presence at the front line had held his men together when any ordinary unit would have broken. For his actions, he would later receive the Medal of Honor. The citation described his indomitable courage and magnificent leadership, noting that his defense enabled our forces to hold Guadalcanal and secure a decisive victory. For the Japanese survivors, the retreat through the jungle was a nightmare. Kawaguchi's command structure had collapsed. Many of his battalions ceased to exist as organized units. Exhausted and wounded soldiers tried to crawl back toward the coast, only to be ambushed by Marine patrols or cut down by aircraft from Henderson Field, which, thanks to Edson's stand, was still operating. Kawaguchi himself, stunned by the defeat, wandered for days before reaching friendly lines. His report to Tokyo was vague and understated. It admitted heavy losses, but avoided numbers. Japanese High Command, unaware of the full scale of the disaster, continued to send reinforcements to Guadalcanal. men who would meet the same fate in later battles along the Matanikau and at Mount Austin. The Imperial Army would never again launch a successful night assault on that scale in the Pacific. The myth of Japanese invincibility, the belief that seishin or fighting spirit could overcome firepower, had shattered on a ridge defended by 800 exhausted Marines. In the days that followed, the Marines fortified the ridge with barbed wire, machine gun emplacements, and trenches. They nicknamed it Bloody Ridge, and the name stuck. It became a place of pilgrimage for the men of the 1st Marine Division, not out of pride, but respect. They knew how close they had come to being overrun. Guadalcanal itself was far from secure. The battle would rage for 5 more months before Japan finally withdrew, leaving behind 25,000 dead. But the defense of Edson's Ridge marked a turning point. It was the first time in the Pacific that a major Japanese offensive had been decisively defeated on land. The victory also saved Henderson Field, allowing the Cactus Air Force to continue operating, a crucial factor in halting Japanese reinforcements by sea. Historians later agreed that if the ridge had fallen, Guadalcanal, and perhaps the entire Solomon Islands campaign, might have been lost. Years later, survivors of the battle would still remember the sounds of that night, the screams, the gunfire, the rain. Many described it as the fiercest fighting they ever experienced. One Marine said, "It was like fighting ghosts in the dark. They just kept coming, and we kept firing until there was nothing left to shoot." Another wrote, "We stopped them with sweat, blood, and pure stubbornness. If we'd lost, Henderson would have been gone, and if Henderson was gone, the war might have lasted years longer." Today, the ridge still exists on Guadalcanal, quiet beneath the tropical sun. The jungle has reclaimed the foxholes, and the rusted remnants of helmets and shell casings lie buried under vines. A small monument stands at the summit, dedicated to the Marines and sailors who fought there. It bears a simple inscription: "In memory of the men who held the ridge and saved Guadalcanal. September 12th to 14th, 1942. The Battle of Bloody Ridge became part of the Marine Corps' legacy, the story of a few hundred men who held their ground against impossible odds. It proved that courage, discipline, and leadership could triumph even when outnumbered 4-1. The Japanese thought they had surrounded the Americans. Instead, the Marines surrounded history, and on a rain-soaked ridge above Henderson Field, they rewrote the fate of the Pacific War.